Parts 5 through 8 of Cosmic Castaway by Jacobi. This librivox recording is in the public domain. Part 5. But it was possible. As Standish ran forward, he saw a hatch open in the metal sphere and a man climb out. And yet it wasn't a man. The face and body were normal, but the arms and legs were vine-like appendages with segmented fronds for hands. When this person saw Standish, it recoiled and whipped a knife out from a scabbard at its waist. Quickly, the Earthman raised one arm above his head in the common symbol of friendliness. A smile of recognition crossed the little man's face. He nodded and raised his frond-like hand in a similar gesture. Then he pointed to himself and said, "Gamar!" The rocketship now came under Standish's gaze. He saw that it was of a design foreign to any craft he had ever seen before. Spherical in shape, with a series of strange-looking fins along the sides, its stern rudders were formed of crude exhaust jettisons, and the several ports were formed of a transparent material that resembled quartz. Gamar, for it was evident those syllables formed the stranger's name, opened the hatch door and motioned Standish to enter. Without hesitation, the Earthman did so. Inside was a single cabin with a control panel occupying 2 of the 4 walls. Gamar pressed a button and a panel slid open in the floor, revealing the motor chamber. The stranger pointed downward, then shook his head violently. Standish nodded. "Motors went dead on you, eh? Well, my friend, it looks as though you and I were in the same fix. Come along, and I'll show you my diggings." But when Gamar looked upon the wrecked spaceliner, he stared incredulously. He walked its entire length as if doubting its proportions. "Yes, she's big all right," Standish smiled, aware that he was not understood. "But she's no good, the way she is now. Now, how about a little food?" In his forecastle home, the Earthman set out a bottle of wine and some cakes. He noted that Gamar used his front hands with great dexterity, but that he betrayed no surprise at Standish's own physical appearance. Once the stranger had eaten, Standish began the necessary task of providing a common means of communication. He used the Corelli sound system, a short-cut method of acquainting the ear and the eye simultaneously with objects of fundamental importance. Within 2 hours, he found he could converse with Gamar with a minimum amount of difficulty. Haltingly, then, the stranger began to speak. "I am from the city Calthedra of the planet Lyra of the system Arbitorius. My race was once a great people, but raiders from another planet destroyed our civilization. All we have left is a few rocket ships of the kind in which I came. These were built long ago by our ancestors, and only a few of us know how to operate them." Standish nodded. "How came you here?" "I was voyaging to visit my brother on our satellite Zora, when those same raiders caught sight of me and gave chase. My space compass broke, and I became lost. I found my way here just as my rocket motors consumed the last of their power." "I see." Standish lit his pipe and began to smoke slowly. "And these raiders, they come from near here?" "From Sirius," Gamar replied. "They raid us for funds to continue their war with a planet many light years away." For a full moment Standish sat there rigid. Then the pipe fell from his hands, and he leaped to his feet. "Sirius!" he cried. "So those butchers are not content to place in bondage all the solar system. They must plague other worlds also." He paced the length of the forecastle. "Tell me," he said, whirling abruptly, "do you know of a Sirian leader called Drum Faggard?" Gamar's eyes gleamed. "Aye! The cruelest and most bloodthirsty of them all. It was he who led the attack against my people in which my brother was killed. It was he who directed the sacking of our city of Calthedra. My one hope is that some day we may meet on common ground." The next day, Standish revealed to the newcomer his plan to build a smaller spaceship out of the wreckage of the old. "Your own craft is useless without power for rocket motors," he told Gamar. "Yet it contains parts that will be valuable. Have I your consent to dismantle it?" The stranger nodded. "To work, then. And remember, if we succeed, we may yet be able to strike at Drumthagard." It was the desire for revenge that spurred them on. Quickly they set about dismantling Gamar's ship. Rivets were cut, bolts unscrewed, plates ripped off. Using the dismantled parts of the space liner's atomic motors, Standish fashioned a smaller but powerful engine. Gradually, out of the mass, a crude craft began to take form. But they were working on counted time. Days were growing shorter, the nights longer. Icy winds began to sweep across the ravine, bringing sleet and flurries of snow. With the change in seasons came new dangers. Strange animal life, following the perverse migrational instinct of the planet, swept out of the jungle. First came the lizard birds, similar to but larger than the one which had attacked Standish. They came over the cliff in squadron formation, a dense cloud that blotted out the sky. For 2 days the men were kept prisoners while the flock stalked back and forth about the ravine like a vast Roman encampment. A week later the Thrads came. It was Gamar who called them Thrads. They were a tiny species of anthropoid, no larger than a squirrel, with bright red bodies. Inquisitive and bold, they hampered the 2 men as they gathered close to watch the work. The ship was nearing completion. While Standish labored at the control adjustments, Gamar carried in a supply of food concentrates from the wrecked liner. Along the length of the ravine, an inclined runway was built for a takeoff. At the end of this, Standish constructed a rifle-like catapult using the parts of Gamar's rocket motor and a quantity of trinitate cellulose he found in the liner. If the device worked, it would multiply their initial trajectory power and quicken their passage through the planet's gravitational field. At length, Standish fastened the last bolt of the crude new ship in its place. Nervously, he pressed the starting button. The single motor began with a smooth, powerful hum. The ship strained at its moorings. "Ready, Gamar? We'll give her a trial flight and see how she handles." The little man grinned, shouted. "Cast off!" he cried. "Cast off!" Standish severed the mooring cable of the ship with one shot from his genethode pistol. The 2 men yanked shut the hatch, screwed down the airlock. With a yank, the Earthman threw over the control lever. Up from the ground the ship shot. Through the floor panel, Standish saw the ground receding. "Take the controls," he told Gamar. "I'm going to try and chart a course for your planet." The planet rose up before them, like a great ripened peach. It had taken Standish long hours to calculate with his elementary astrophysics the location of their destination. Gamar had supplied what information he could, but he knew only that the planet Lyra was bordered by a spiral nebula on one side, and that it revolved about a sun some 100 million miles distant. As they approached now, Gamar betrayed no emotion. "The city of Calthedra is on the other hemisphere," he said. "I'll direct you to the landing." They crept slowly along the surface, and the Earthman found himself looking upon a land similar in many respects to his own. Nostalgia seized him. Here were lakes and woods and broad fields in the state of cultivation. Here were lanes, roads, and hedges, a tracery of browns and greens that was good to see. But when a moment later Gamar pointed out the port and said, "Calthedra," Standish's jaw set hard. The city had been devastated. Buildings stood in ruins. Towers were crumbled masses of masonry. Only one structure seemed to have escaped the fearful onslaught, a globe-shaped building fashioned of some kind of black metal. The Earthman saw the landing place and guided the ship downward. Below he could see people milling about excitedly, groups of them pointing upward. The moment the ship came to rest, Gamor threw open the hatch and climbed out. Standish followed, to find an assemblage drawn up suspiciously in battle array, their weapons ready for any hostile move of the newcomers. In the foreground stood a taller man of Lyra, wearing a suit of copper-colored chainmail and a helmet studded with gleaming chips of yellow metal. At his sides were two men in white flowing robes. All had high brows, penetrating eyes, and frond-like appendages in lieu of arms and legs. Gamor ran forward and embraced the man in the helmet. "My father," he said, "this man is Mason Standish, a great warrior from the planet Earth. He has rescued me from certain death and has brought me back to your empire at the risk of his life." The Emperor paced forward. A benevolent smile played across his lips. "He who befriends my son has my gratitude," he said softly. Standish was bewildered. Gamor had made no mention of the fact that he was of royal birth. It was a long time before the Earthman found his tongue. "Your son tells me that your people and my people are at war with a common enemy. May I ask how long since the Syrians made their last attack upon you?" "Within the risings of 12 suns," the Emperor replied. "But come, let us go to the palace where we may speak alone." Standish missed no detail of his passage through the city. Calthedra, besides being hard hit by the invaders, was quite evidently in the process of decay. Streets were racked and unrepaired. House windows were broken and open to the elements, and on all sides the Earthman saw faces devoid of intelligence staring at him. But when he climbed the steps and followed Gamor and the Emperor into the black metal globe, he entered a different world. A vast pillared hall stretched before him. On one side a balustraded ramp led to the upper levels. Opposite were a pair of high triangular doorways, each opening into separate chambers. The air was cool and exhilarating, and seemed to have a different chemical content than that of the street. "This is our palace," Gamor said, "built thousands of years before, when our people were a great civilization. It alone has withstood all the attacks our planet has been exposed to." "Why?" demanded Standish. "I should think this would be the enemy's first striking place." Gamor shook his head. "I do not understand the science of it myself. It is something in the black metal. It is an electron-stripped element, I believe, tremendously heavy and impregnable to any weapon of cosmic warfare." They reached the last doorway and entered the royal quarters. The Emperor and his son sat down before a circular table and motioned Standish to a chair opposite. The older man removed his helmet and closed his eyes as if in weariness. "Earthman," he said at length, "you come at a time when my planet is sorely in need of help. I don't know how much my son has told you, but if you will listen, I will tell you the history of Lyra. But first, I have something to show you." He touched a button on the table, and a chime sounded melodiously in the outer corridor. A servant appeared in the doorway. "Tell Thalia I would see her at once," the Emperor said. A moment later light steps sounded, and Standish looked up curiously. What he saw brought him out of his chair with a cry of pleasure and amazement. The figure of a girl, an Earth girl of his own race, stood there on the threshold. End of Part 5. Part 6. For a full moment, as their eyes met, man and girl stared speechless. To Standish, who a few short weeks ago had thought himself cut off forever from his people, she was a vision of loveliness. Her hair was dark, and her face was a delicate one of natural beauty. "This is Thalia," the Emperor said, "born on your planet, but brought here as a child. Perhaps you recall a liner, the Colossus, which was lost and never reached port some 20 years ago." "Glory, yes!" exclaimed Standish. The Colossus was destroyed by the Syrians. It was their first attack on an Earth craft, and I believe the initial act which led them on. Thalia was the only survivor when we came upon the ship, drifting a derelict." The girl stepped forward, now shyly. "My greetings," she said. Standish took her hand, and a strange thrill shot through him. Then the Emperor leaned back in his chair, lit a short metal pipe, and began his story. Thousands of years before, the Syrians had come to raid this planet, Lyra, attracted by the wealth of minerals, coronium, thanium, margon, gold, and silver. They had destroyed the libraries, the laboratories, the schools. They had killed the scientists and all men suspected of higher intelligence. For generations, the people of Lyra had been held in bondage. Then an emperor had come into power, gifted with a scientific reasoning far in advance of his time. He had constructed a warp in space on 3 sides of the planet. This alteration of the space-time coordinates served as an impregnable defense. Until Drum Faggard had come upon the scene, with but one desire, to continue his war on Earth and the solar system. Faggard had broken through the space warp and destroyed the time machine that operated it. "And so," concluded the Emperor, "we of Lyra today are but ghosts of our past. Our heritage has been stolen from us. We are far removed in space, so have been unable to obtain allies. Even your planet, Earth, does not know of our presence. The Syrians have told us that your observers believe Lyra unfit to support life, and the few rocket ships we have left are not capable of crossing that immense distance." Standish sat in thoughtful silence. Abruptly the girl, Thalia, moved to his side. "Will you help us?" she said. "You have knowledge, and knowledge is power. Will you aid Lyra in its fight for freedom?" Standish stood up slowly, face a grim line of determination. "Yes," he said, "I'll do all I can." He began with a survey of the city of Calthedra. With Gamar answering his many questions, Standish passed from street to street, building to building. No detail missed his sharp eyes. He saw the wreckage of the space warp machine, broken ray cannon, the debris-choked lower levels where once light-hearted Lyrans had their libraries and laboratories. Then Standish spent 2 days devising an intelligence test, as he remembered them from his Earth studies. The test, he instructed Gamar, was to be given to every able-bodied man in Calthedra. He spent a week more checking the results. But at length, from the mass of papers, he selected 24 Lyrans whose IQ rating and general scientific aptitude seemed in advance of their fellows. The Earthman then revealed his plan to Gamar. "We're going to build a spaceship," he said. "A super-destroyer with the most powerful atomic motors I've ever designed. We're going to take this war into our own hands. Attack rather than wait to be attacked." A call for workmen was broadcast. The response was overwhelming. All Calthedra, all Lyra wanted to help the man from Earth in the struggle to free them from bondage. With the 24 picked men as overseers, the work began. A flat space was selected beyond the outskirts of the city. Food depots were thrown up, together with temporary housing quarters. Like a colony of ants, the workmen labored in 3 shifts. At night, the work went on by the light of solar condenser lamps mounted on towers at every point of vantage. The ship began to take form. A long cigar-shaped blue-black hull was fashioned out of feluranium, a metal peculiar to Lyra, which Standish toughened by the addition of 5 alloys. At intermittent spaces along that hull, disappearing ray guns were swivel-mounted, operated and loaded by remote control. The Earthman personally supervised the installation of the atomic motors. Each he had given the most strenuous block tests. Switched on, they purred like 6 gargantuan cats, alive with effortless strength. Finally, Gamar climbed out of the huge cabin and smiled. "It is complete," he said. "Only the heat units remain to be tested. What now?" "Now," said Standish. But his words were never finished. From the roof of the palace the warning siren burst into a wailing clamor. Gamar's face blanched. "The Syrians!" he cried. "They'll destroy all we've done." With a single leap, Standish was across to the microphone of the field amplifying system. "Wait!" his voice boomed out. "If you run, all your work will be for nothing. We still have a chance, but we must hide the ship. I want each of you to bring here every movable object you can find. Do you understand? Every movable object." The field saw strange activity then. While the siren continued to scream out its warning, an endless procession of Lyrons raced in and out of Cathedra, carrying stone blocks, furniture, doors, articles of every description. "Looks like moving day back on Earth," Standish said to Gamar with a lightness he didn't feel. His fists clenched. "We'll beat them yet." He ran for the palace. Even as he raced up the inclined ramp of the rear entrance, he saw 5 Syrian battlecruisers land with a roar in the central square. Inside, Standish moved swiftly to the quarters of the Emperor. The old man was leaning weakly against a chair, eyes smoldering. Without preamble, the Earthman explained what he had done. Then he had barely time to leap through the doorway into the adjoining room. Heavy steps sounded in the hall. A moment later 6 men entered the chamber and strode belligerently to the Emperor. 5 of them were Syrians. The 6th was a man of Earth, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a bullet head and a cruel, predatory face. This was Drum Faggard. He wore the Syrian uniform, and a flowing scarlet cloak hung from his shoulders. At his waist were holstered 2 long-barreled Genethode pistols. "Your minds are lying idle," Faggard snarled. "Why?" Through the crevice between the partially closed doors, Standish saw the Emperor shrug eloquently. "We have had troubles." "What troubles?" The Emperor hesitated. "Labor," he said. "My workers refuse to toil further when the results of their work are stolen from them. They see no reason to struggle for the benefit of murdering raiders." Blunt anger crimsoned Faggard's face. He struck the Emperor hard across the face. "Watch your tongue, fool!" Standish made fists of his hands. He had an overpowering desire to leap into the room and seize the renegade. To do that, however, he knew would mean failure for his plans. Drum Faggard paced to a window. "What is the meaning of all that material piled outside the city?" Quietly, the Emperor continued to play his part. "We are moving to new grounds," he explained. "Moving higher into the hills. The weather on Lyra is changing, growing warmer due to the planet's gradual approach to our sun. Surely your observers must have noticed it." For a long moment the renegade stood there, motionless, digesting this information. Then he crossed back to the table, slammed a mailed fist down upon it. "Old man, I give you one more chance. Either those mines are worked and a double amount of ore made ready for us, or we level Cathedra to the ground. Do you understand? We will return later." He turned on his heel, and the 5 Syrians followed puppet-like into the corridor. Darting across to the window, Standish saw them march pompously across the square and enter the space cruisers. A moment later, with a roar of rocket exhaust, the 6 armored vessels shot upward. Standish turned and ran out the door, heading for the landing field. Halfway, he met Gamar. "The ruse worked," the Emperor's son exulted. "They've gone." "Order the ship cleared," Standish commanded. "We take off at once." Quickly, the screen of material was torn from the new ship. A vat of necessary water and a case of food concentrate were hastily carried into the storage chamber. The 24 chosen Lyrans took their places. In the pilot cuddy, Standish nodded to Gamar and pulled down the microphone of the ship address system. "Close stern hatch," he ordered. A dial flicked on the panel before him, and from the loudspeaker a voice answered. "Hatch closed, sir." "Closed midships tower." "Midships tower closed." "Gunner's mate," Standish called. "Test all gun swivels, airlocks, and automatic loaders." There was a moment's pause, then, "All guns tested, sir." Standish motioned Gamar to shut the pilot cuddy hatch. But before Gamar could swing the hermetic barrier into position, a lithe figure leaped down the ladder. It was the Earth girl, Thalia. "I'm going with you," she said. "This is my battle as well as yours." Standish looked into her defiant black eyes and frowned. But the refusal that rose to his lips died unsounded. He nodded and motioned her to the settee on the far side of the cuddy. In rotation, then, he snapped on the 6 atomic motors. A dull tremor of life and power shook the ship. Then Standish seized an electro-welder left behind by some workmen, flung open the hatch, and ran outside to the stern of the ship. Roughly, while Gamar watched bewildered, he seared the name Phantom on the Feloranium hull. He leaped back to the cuddy, slammed shut the hatch, and threw over the acceleration lever. The huge ship lifted from the field of its birth and roared up into the stratosphere. End of Part 6. Part 7. It was Standish's plan to permit the 6 departing Syrian cruisers to cover sufficient distance that they would not associate him, immediately at least, with the plundered planet Lyra. With unleashed power at his fingertips, he planned to pass his quarry on a higher plane, then circle and return. The Phantom functioned like a dream. Up through space she bored, annihilating distance, sweeping out into the star fields in hot pursuit. Warm, clear air circulated out from the oxygenizers. Each dial and gauge told its proper story. Even the heat units, which had not been properly tested, operated smoothly. Standish pulled down the cosmoscope and surveyed the way ahead. He saw star clusters and constellations. Ahead, tails sweeping out in a blaze of glory, a comet crossed his path. But nowhere did he sight the Syrian cruisers. "I'm afraid they've got too great a start on us," said Gamar. Thalia drew in her breath sharply. "That black speck ahead." Standish threw over the accelerator another notch and twisted helm sharply. The Phantom answered her controls. The Earthman was maneuvering for position now. Far below him, he saw the 6 cruisers materialize in his vision. And then, with a dull roar, the Phantom swung and leaped for the attack. "They see us!" Thalia cried. "They're going into battle formation." With Drum Faggard's flagship in the lead, the 6 cruisers turned and headed toward them in squadron formation. It was evident that they were still unaware of the identity of the black ship. The visit screen clicked on, and Faggard's face appeared in the panel. "We are Section 1, General Syrian Expeditionary Force, Sirius to Earth, heading for regular interplanetary lanes," he said, following the customary salutation. "Who are you?" Standish flipped on his own microphone, but disconnected the vision panel so that no return image would be broadcast. "Destroyer Phantom," he replied, muffling his voice. "Captain Ether commanding. Stand by for boarding, or we open fire on you." Faggard's gross face, crimson with rage, flashed back on the screen. "Are you mad? We are 6 to your 1. From what planet do you come? Show your colors." "I'll show my colors," Standish muttered, a grim smile playing about his lips. He switched on the ship address system. "Port gunner, stand by for shot across enemy's bows. Elevation 6, trajectory 5. There was an excited reply. Standish twisted his helm a fraction of a turn. Fire! The Phantom recoiled slightly, but there was no sound, no telltale streak of flame. Only on the Syrian flagship was there any evidence of what had happened. A gaping hole appeared in the vessel's hull. The ship faltered momentarily. Then, Standish knew, hermetic bulkheads automatically closed, and she swung on a wide arc. "They're spreading out," Gamar said. "They're going to attack from both sides." The flagship shot into another plane. The remaining 5 cruisers surged toward the Phantom, firing as they came. Standish saw the strategy and realized he was pitted against no amateur fighter. He signaled to fire both forward guns, holding his position boldly. At that moment, one of the cruisers attempted a maneuver old in space warfare. Charging head-on toward the Phantom, the cruiser's commander sought to frighten Standish into turning broadside. Thalia uttered a scream. "They're going to ram us!" she cried. The Earthman nodded. "Let them. If they do, they'll be in for a surprise." On came the cruiser. The Phantom did not alter her course, and then, at the moment the Syrian realized the ruse had failed, Standish threw his helm, heading directly toward the enemy. The 2 vessels struck squarely. In the pilot cuddy, Standish, Gamar, and Thalia were hurled to the floor. The Earthman struggled erect, helped the girl to her feet. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No, but the ship—" "Look." Standish pointed out the port. A horrible sight met the girl's eyes. The Phantom's stout feluranium sides were unharmed, but the Syrian cruiser had broken into 3 sections. Even as she watched, figures were catapulted out into space, and the whole mass of debris began to rotate slowly around another enemy ship, forming a macabre satellite. The remaining 4 cruisers circled and began to close in. "All starboard guns," Standish ordered. "Elevation 1, double charge. Fire!" The recoil was jarring. 2 cruisers fell back, rocket motors stilled, huge rents in their forward quarters. And with that, Drum Faggart's flagship and the other cruiser turned about and fled. "They've had enough," Gamar exulted. "Faggart is the one I want," Standish said. "We'll come back and tow in those 2 disabled ships later." But the Earthmen had reckoned without the huge planetoid swarm which lay directly in their path. The 2 Syrian ships plunged into the middle of these miniature worlds and in an instant were lost. Power control wide open, Standish zoomed in pursuit, but though he swung the cosmoscope to every angle, he saw no sign of his quarry. "He slid through our fingers this time," he told Gamar bitterly, "but our chance will come again." Heavily he swung the tiller and returned to the area of combat. The 2 helpless cruisers and the portions of the 3rd were drifting idly without steerageway. Standish steered the Phantom alongside, shot out the magnetic grappling bars, and secured the 2 derelicts. Then he headed the big ship back to Lyra. A great crowd awaited them. As the Phantom and its twin burdens settled slowly downwards, hundreds of Lyrans ran to the landing field. The court guard, resplendent in shining armor, took their places in formation, and the Emperor and his ministers hastily assembled on a raised pavilion. Then the 2 wrecked cruisers were opened and the prisoners led forth. "You will be well treated," the Emperor addressed them collectively. "We do not subjugate our captives of war after your fashion, but until the Syrians cease their raids upon this planet, you will not be permitted to leave." Standish ordered the Phantom inspected and such damage as had been inflicted by Drum Faggart's guns repaired. Then, with Thalia at his side, he moved slowly toward the palace. "Someday," he said, "all this will be over. I don't know how, but I'm going to do everything in my power to bring this bloody war to an end. Then—" The girl smiled and lowered her eyes. "Then?" she prompted softly. But Standish colored and became suddenly silent. Even during the heat of battle, his heart had not beat as fast as it was beating now. End of Part 7. Part 8. 6 Lyran months had passed since Standish and Gamar had escaped from the unknown planet. During those months, the fame of the Phantom had spread as fast as light. From the constellation Cygnus to the 12th and 15th magnitude stars, the name of Captain Ether, behind which Standish hid his identity, swept through the interplanetary lanes. Transports from powerful and peaceful Alpha Centauri moved with extra convoys, ready for instant action. No one knew when the Phantom would strike. No one knew from which planet it came to attack like a black meteor without warning. Yet Standish challenged no ship but those of Sirius. Haunting the lanes between Sirius and Earth, he seized enemy prison ships and troop transports alike with daring regularity. The city of Calthedra was filled to overflowing with Sirian prisoners. But the man Standish wanted most, Drum Faggard, was never on a captured ship. Desire to capture Faggard became almost an obsession as the Earthman went on. Through the powerful radio which he had built on Lyra, he learned of the situation on Earth day by day. The news was black. Canada, Mexico, and Central America were now part of the armed camp of the invaders. The greater United States alone had managed to remain independent. Breastworks a quarter of a mile high had been erected on the Canadian and Mexican frontiers. The only bright spot was the fact that Faggard's big push had failed. Often Standish smiled as he listened in on radio messages between the Syrian government and Drum Faggard at his Frisco base. "The Phantom has been sighted, lurking near Ganymede. Dispatch 5 cruisers to that satellite immediately." And again, "The Phantom, it is learned on definite authority, comes from some point in future time. It is able to maintain speed in excess of light, violating the Fitzgerald contraction, riding the fourth-dimensional continuum." To which Drum Faggard always snarled the same reply: "Whoever Captain Ether is, I'll get him. Give me time." It was the day of his return from his most successful raid, and Standish and Thalia were walking arm in arm through the palace garden on Lyra. Flowers were in the full bloom of the planet's early summer, and the sun glowed upon them warmly. "The Phantom is not enough," the Earthman said. "Powerful as she is, she can only plague the Sirians like a single hornet. With all my efforts, I have not halted the war against Earth one iota." Thalia shook her head. "You've done all one person possibly could do." "I need an army and a fleet," Standish said. "Yet on all Lyra there will not be sufficiently trained men to furnish either for a long time." The girl stood there, idly plucking the petals of a flower. Abruptly she turned. "The Syrian prisoners! Even the private soldiers are equipped with scientific knowledge. Why not use them?" But Standish shook his head. "They would refuse. We could force them to do physical work, of course, but that's all. Listen!" Excitement suddenly entered Thalia's voice. "In the laboratories in the lower levels there is a machine built by the early Lyrans long ago. No one understands its operation now, but it is some kind of an electro-hypnotic machine. Couldn't you use it on the Syrians and make them want to help us?" A glitter in his eyes, Standish considered a moment, then leaped to his feet. "Let's have a look," he said. They left the garden, crossed the square, and entered the ancient tunnel that led to the old laboratories. In the first level the Earthman found nothing that answered the girl's description. But in a storage room far back in the second tier he came upon 2 of the strange machines, dust-covered, in places red with rust. Mounted on wheels, the instruments consisted of a small cart with twin panels and a confusing array of dials. Above each machine was a helix of tightly wound silver wire. At the bottom was a transparent globe, still half filled with a thick greenish liquid. According to Gamor, Thalia said, these machines were used by the early Syrians for medical purposes. They found in the principle of applied hypnosis a cure for a great many ills. Standish nodded. Without further word, he took up a small wrench and removed the panel from one of the instruments, carefully examining the revealed wiring. They seem to be constructed for use on ordinary electric power, but not the power supplied by Calthedra's dynamos. I'll have to step up the frequency. He opened a wall switchboard and quickly connected 2 wires to the machine. On a table he found a transformer. Thalia stood by in silence while he hooked up wires, condensers, and a small loading coil. Presently he looked up with a nod. "We'll give her a try and see what happens." "Stand over there in front of the helix," Standish said. "I don't think there's any danger. Unless I'm wrong, the thing simply places the patient in an electric-magnetic field and transmits an alternating vibration to the human brain." He played with the dials a long time, twisting a rheostat experimentally. "Notice anything?" "Yes, The Earth girl's voice died off. A vacant look entered her eyes. "What is your wish?" she asked suddenly. Standish made a quick adjustment to the controls. "Sit down," he commanded. Obediently, Thalia moved across to a chair and sat stiffly erect. "You have studied some mathematics," Standish said then. "Tell me, what is the principle of the algebraic curve?" Without hesitation, Thalia replied. "A curve, the equation of which contains no transcendental qualities, a figure the intercepted diameters of which bears always the same proportion to their respective ordinates." Standish uttered a low cry of triumph and threw over the reverse lever of the machine. An instant later, Thalia stared at him in bewilderment. "What happened?" "It worked," Standish replied. "With that device and 100 more like it I will build, I can control every last Syrian prisoner. I can make them help us build an entire fleet using all their scientific knowledge." Thalia's eyes glowed. "We'll be fighting them with their own people," she said. End of Part 8.